stop it there. I'll begin with the first chapter. Is it the same translation or probably not? I'll try and use the one on the screen because I don't think I see everyone with a version in front of them. It's probably not the same version. No, it's not quite, so I'll use this one. In the big building of the law courts, during a break-in hearing the case of Melvinsky's, the members and the prosecutor met in Ivan Yegorovich Shebek's office, and the conversation turned to the famous Krasovsky case. Fyodor Vasilyevich became heated, demonstrating non-jurisdiction. Ivan Yegorovich stood his ground. As for Peter Ivanovich, not having entered into the argument in the beginning, he took no part in it and was looking through the just delivered Gazette. "Gentlemen," he said, "Ivan Ilych is dead." "Can it be?" "Here, read it," he said to Fyodor Vasilyevich, handing him the paper still smelling of fresh ink. Now, old newspapers, you wouldn't even remember that. They used to be printed in newsprint and black, and your hands would get black from it. It's hot off the press. Inside a black border was printed, "It is with profound grief that Praskovia Fyodorovna Golovin informs relations and acquaintances of the passing away of her beloved husband, Ivan Ilyich Golovin, member of the Court of Law, which took place on the 4th of February of this year, 1882. The funeral will take place on Friday at 1 p.m. Ivan Ilyich had been a colleague of the assembled gentlemen, and they had all liked him. He had been ill for several weeks. It had been said that his illness was incurable. His post had been kept open for him, but there was an understanding that, in case of his death, Alexeyev might be named to his post, and to Alexeyev's post either Vinnikov or Stabel. So that on hearing of Ivan Ilych's death, the first thought of each of the gentlemen assembled in the office was of what this death might mean in terms of transfers or promotions of the members themselves or of their acquaintances. So note, and this is what is so brilliant about Tolstoy, by the way, is that he is a brilliant analyst of human psychology and motivation. He does not varnish it over. He is aware of how bad people are without condemning it. And that's part of the power, is that he just passes over it matter-of-factly, accurately. And already we get a sense, and it's without him intruding upon us and pushing in any sense of moral consideration on us, that we see the reality of how these people view their lives and death. Because we're told that he was their friend. And the first thing they thought about was how they might benefit from his death. Pretty ugly. If you think that's not you, then you're not being very realistic, because people are like this, you and me. That's how sinful we are, truthfully. Now I'll probably get Stabel or Vinnikov's post, thought Fyodor Vasilyevich. It was promised to me long ago, and the promotion means a raise of 800 rubles, plus office expenses. I must now request my brother-in-law's transfer from Kaluga, thought Pyotr Ivanovich. My wife will be very glad. Now she won't be able to say I've never done anything for her family. I thought he would never get on his feet, Pyotr Ivanovich said aloud. What a pity. But what exactly did he have? The doctors couldn't determine. That is, they did, but differently. When I saw him the last time, it seemed to me he'd recover. And I haven't visited him since the holidays. I kept meaning to. Did he have money? It seems his wife has a little something, but quite insignificant. Yes, we'll have to go. They live terribly far away. From you, that is. Everything's far from you. See. He can't forgive me for living across the river, Pyotr Ivanovich said, smiling at Shebek. And they started talking about the long distances in town and went back to the session. Now, what's going on here? One lives on the other side of the river in not a very socially advantageous place, and he's being judged by the other fellow. He just throws it out in passing. And he smiles, and it's like, I'm pretending that wasn't an implicit slight, but it was. And apart from the reflections this death called up in each of them about the transfers and possible changes at work that might result from it, the very fact of the death of a close acquaintance called up in all those who heard of it, as always, a feeling of joy that it was he who was dead and not I. You see, he's dead, and I'm not. Each of them thought or felt. Close acquaintances, Ivan Ilych's so-called friends, involuntarily thought as well that it would now be necessary for them to fulfill the very boring obligations of decency and go to the funeral service and to the widow on a visit of condolence. Closest of all were Fyodor Vasilyevich and Peter Ivanovich. Peter Ivanovich had been Ivan Ilych's comrade in law school and considered him as under obligation to him. Having told his wife over dinner the news of Ivan Ilych's death and his reflections on the possible transfer of his brother-in-law to their district, because now they can move to Moscow and the whole family can come in. Before he's had to commute from outside Moscow, he can come in, work, and then he has to go back out because he doesn't have a permit to stay. But if he gets this position, now the whole family can move in. It changes the whole family dynamic. They've moved up in the world. Hooray. Peter Ivanovich, without lying down to rest, put on his tailcoat and drove to Ivan Ilych's. And at the entrance to Ivan Ilych's apartment stood a carriage and 2 cabs. Downstairs in the front hall by the coat rack, leaning against the wall, was a silk brocaded coffin lid with tassels and freshly polished gold braid. 2 ladies in black were taking off their fur coats. Very posh society. One, Ivan Ilych's sister, he knew. The other was an unknown lady. Peter Ivanovich's colleague, Schwartz, was about to come downstairs, and from the topmost step, seeing him enter, stopped and winked at him, as if to say, Ivan Ilych made a botch of it. We'll do better, you and I. Schwartz's face, with its English side whiskers, and his whole slim figure in its tailcoat had, as usual, an elegant solemnity, and this solemnity, always in contrast to Schwartz's playful character, had a special piquancy here. So thought Peter Ivanovich. Peter Ivanovich let the ladies go ahead of him and slowly followed them up the stairs. Schwartz did not start down, but remained upstairs. Peter Ivanovich understood why. He obviously wanted to arrange where to play Vint that evening. Now, Vint is a card game. So he's come together. They're there for the funeral. They're doing what they have to do. They're going to pay respects. But he's like a mischievous boy saying, we're all here and, when are we playing? Because we're not going to have our cards interrupted by this event. The ladies went on upstairs to the widow, and Schwartz, with seriously compressed, firm lips and a playful glance, moved his eyebrows to show Peter Ivanovich to the right, to the dead man's room. Peter Ivanovich went in, as always happens, with some perplexity about what he was to do there. One thing he did know, that crossing oneself on such occasions never did any harm. So we do a lot of crossing. Am I do it the right way? Or do I do it from this way to the? But a lot of crossing. Concerning the need to bow at the same time, he was not quite sure, and therefore he chose something in between. Going into the room, he began to cross himself and to bow slightly, as it were. At the same time, insofar as his moving hand and head allowed him, he looked around the room. Now you can imagine this. It's a comic scene. And 2 young men, one a schoolboy, nephews apparently, were crossing themselves as they left the room. A little old lady stood motionless, and a lady with strangely raised eyebrows was saying something to her in a whisper. A reader in a frock coat, brisk, resolute, was loudly reading something with an expression that precluded all contradiction. The butler's helper, Gerasim, here's this figure, passing in front of Peter Ivanovich with light steps, sprinkled something on the floor. Seeing this, Peter Ivanovich at once sensed a slight smell of decaying corpse. And what he's putting on the ground is something to hide the smell. During his last visit with Ivan Ilych, Peter Ivanovich had seen this muzyk in his study. It's derogatory. He had performed the duties of a nurse, and Ivan Ilych had especially liked him. Peter Ivanovich kept crossing himself and bowing slightly in an intermediary direction between the coffin, the reader, and the icons on a table in the corner. You know what icons are. Have you seen Russian Orthodox churches and so forth? It's pictures of Christ or the Trinity or saints and sort of flat. It's a type, I don't want to call it painting. An icon's an icon. It has a very special religious significance in Russian Orthodox. The icons are there alongside the other people in the room. Then when this movement of crossing himself with his hands seemed to have gone on too long, he stopped and began to examine the dead man. So what you see here is he's going through rituals, but they're pretty much meaningless for him. He knows he's supposed to do it, but the rituals, everything that, even the crossing, which is brought to our attention, brings to mind a death and the significance of the death, but it has no meaning for him. And the bowing, and he's not sure quite what, and so it's ludicrous. The whole scene is ludicrous, except that it's not ludicrous because it's a poignant scene. This is a friend, and we have two friends who know him extremely well. One, his old school friend from university, law school, and he can't wait to get out of there to play cards. The dead man lay as dead men always lie, with a peculiar heaviness, dead man fashion. His stiffened limbs sunk into the lining of the coffin, his forever bent head on the pillow displaying, as dead men always do, his yellow waxen forehead with the hair brushed forward on his sunken temples and his thrust out nose as if pressing down on his upper lip. He had changed very much, had grown still thinner since Peter Ivanovich last saw him, but as with all dead people, his face was more handsome and above all more significant than it had been in the living man. There was on his face the expression that what needed to be done had been done, and done rightly. Besides that, there was also in the expression a reproach or a reminder to the living. So there's a significance to the death, and it's a sign, and it's pointing to something. And part of it's a reproach. What's the reproach? The dead face is telling them off. What's it telling them off for? He doesn't flesh it out here. He doesn't. But from what we've seen thus far, it's that you're ignoring that this is going to happen to you. That's the reproach. This reminder seemed out of place to Peter Ivanovich, or at least of no concern to him. Something felt unpleasant to him, and therefore Peter Ivanovich crossed himself again, hastily, too hastily, as it seemed to him, to conform to decency, turned and went to the door. He can't get out of there quickly enough. Schwartz was waiting for him in the passage, his legs straddled, his hands playing with his top hat besides it on his back. He's sitting back, like a schoolboy. And one glance at Schwartz's playful, clean, and elegant figure refreshed Peter Ivanovich. Peter Ivanovich understood that he, Schwartz, was above it all and would not succumb to depressing impressions. His look alone said, the incident of the funeral service for Ivan Ilych could in no way serve as a sufficient motive for considering the order of the session disrupted. What's the session? Yeah. It's not sufficient to stop that. That is, that nothing could prevent them from cracking a newly unsealed deck of the cards that same evening. While a valet set up 4 as yet unlit candles, in general, there were no grounds for supposing that this incident could prevent us from spending that evening pleasantly. He even said so in a whisper to the passing Peter Ivanovich, suggesting that they get together for a game at Fyodor Vasilyevich's. But Peter Ivanovich was evidently not fated to play vint that evening. Praskovia Fyodorovna, a short, fat woman who, despite all her efforts to achieve the contrary, still broadened from the shoulders down, dressed all in black, her head covered with lace, and with the same strangely raised eyebrows as the lady who had stood facing the coffin, came out of her rooms with the other ladies, and accompanying them to the dead man's door, said, "The service will begin at once. Please go in." He didn't get out quickly enough. Schwartz, bowing indefinitely, stood there, apparently neither accepting nor declining this suggestion. Praskovia Fyodorovna, recognizing Peter Ivanovich, sighed, went up close to him, took him by the hand, and said, "I know you were a true friend of Ivan Ilych," and looking at him, expecting some action from him that would correspond to those words. And what does this mean? What is she asking for him, right? What's going to become clear? I know you were a true friend of his. And what is it? No, well, it could be. No, yeah, right, yeah. You're going to be asked to do the yes.
Is it that he would see the same thing and affirm her that they were close to him?
You might think so. And if Tolstoy was not such a keen, had not such keen insight into human nature, she might have goodness in her, but she has no goodness in her. It's not that she means anything well by saying you were a true friend of him. Yes.
Money.
She wants money.
Getting money from the state, right?
Yeah. I mean, you've read, but that's why. You were a true friend of his. And a true friend would not leave the widow without means to look after herself. So she's immediately thinking, again, not about him, but about herself. Just like Peter is, and like every character here. Every character is thinking about themselves, and although they are there for the ostensible purposes of this man's death who is close to them, they actually want out of there as quickly as they can and are thinking about everything but that. Other than that, how they might benefit from it. And even his widow is thinking of that immediately, as no other consideration. But she says, I know you were a true friend of Ivan Ilych, and Peter Ivanovich knew that as there he had to cross himself, so here he had to press her hand, sigh, and say, "Believe me." And so he did. And having done that, he felt the result achieved was the desired one, that he was moved and she was moved. So I feel moved now. We've connected, and now I'm out of here. "Come, while it hasn't started yet, I must talk with you," said the widow. "Give me your arm." Peter Ivanovich offered her his arm, and they went into the inner rooms past Schwartz, who winked mournfully at Peter Ivanovich. And Schwartz says, "There goes our vint. Don't complain if we take another player, unless you join us as a fifth when you get free," said his playful glance, because he's laughing at his friend who's got roped into the whole procession when he tried to get out. Boys' stuff. Peter Ivanovich sighed still more deeply and mournfully, and Praskovia Fyodorovna gratefully pressed his arm. Having gone into her drawing room, upholstered in pink cretonne and with a sullen lamp, they sat by the sofa, she on the sofa, Peter Ivanovich on a low poof, with bad springs that gave way erratically under his weight. She wanted to warn him that he should sit on another chair, but she found such a warning inconsistent with her position and changed her mind as he sat down on his poof. And it's one of these really old-fashioned on the springs, and so it goes down and it creaks, and he goes over and almost falls off of it. As he sat down, he recalled how Ivan Ilych had decorated this drawing room and had consulted him about this same cretonne, pink with green leaves, passing by the table and sitting down on the sofa. The widow caught the black lace of her black mantilla on the carving of the table. Peter Ivanovich got up to release it, and the poof, freed from under him, roused itself and gave him a shove like a spring. The widow began to release the lace herself, and Peter Ivanovich sat down again, crushing the rebellious poof under him. But the widow did not release it completely, and Peter Ivanovich got up again and again. The poof rebelled and even gave a snap. When all this was over, she took out a clean cambric handkerchief and began to cry. The episode with the lace and the struggle with the poof cooled Peter Ivanovich down, and he sat scowling. Yes?
Why didn't they always say his full name? And they never say anybody else, or seldom say anybody else's full name. But they seem to, or he, I suppose, seems to-
In Russian literature, this is one of the worst things for non-English or for English speakers, is that they have three names just like in the Romans did. And one is your patronym and one is your given name. And even worse than that, even with the names, they will give you nicknames and short forms. So a common Russian name is Elena, Helen. But if you are on good terms with Elena, say, call me Lena. Not Helena or Elena, just Lena. And so you will find in the course of the stories that some characters will call Helena Lena or whatever, and then somebody who's really angry at her will call her Lenorka. And you'll say, what? And and in each case, the name is expressing something that we don't actually have in the English language. Because one is a form of intimacy, the name, like James is Jim, or Jimmy. If you want to make fun of him, he might be Jim Bob, or who knows what you call him, but something to irritate him. But that's what's going on in Russian. And in Tolstoy's, they have these triple names, and depending on the relations, they're going to invoke all of the names if you're being formal, or short and abbreviated forms and all that. So a lot of that does not get translated well into English. But it's there, it's part of the nuance of the story. It reflects something of the relations between the characters. But it's just more common. Just like in Asian languages, people often will give you their family name first, and then their given name. Like in Korean, my name's Kim. Of course it is. Yes, I mean, because everybody's named Kim, except they're not all Kim. There are Hongs and so forth. But there's a certain number, and it's a pretty common name. It's like, okay, yes, but why are you giving me that? Because this is an important aspect of the person. And they're effectively telling you, I am of this family. It's part of my identity. We go by the given name. In Russian, further, they take on a Christian name when they become Christians. And that's a further complexity to the whole thing. But the naming thing, yes. Why do they do it? I don't know exactly what the nuance here of her. And here, it's Praskovia Fyodorovna. And no mention of her, the name that she shares with Ilych, with Ivan, which I can't even remember what it is now. Yeah, something like that. Yes. But this awkward, so he's scowling, and this awkward situation was interrupted by Sokolov, Ivan Ilych's butler, with the report that the plot in the cemetery chosen by Praskovia Fyodorovna would cost 200 rubles. She stopped crying and glancing at Peter Ivanovich with the air of a victim, said in French that it was very hard for her. She's being slips into French. The nobility in France ever since or in Russia ever since the French Revolution like to speak in French amongst one another, shows how well bred they are, etc. Yes. That's why.
In the book, he's using French phrases.
Yeah, even more if you ever read War and Peace, they slip into French a lot amongst the aristocrats. It's an expression that they're the new man, they're the Europeans. They're not the benighted Russians. They've been liberated by the French Revolution, and they have pretensions to something more than just being Russian peasants. So they speak French. So it's expressing something about snobbery as much as anything. Yeah. Peter Ivanovich made a silent gesture expressing the unquestionable conviction that it could not be otherwise. "Smoke, please," she said in a magnanimous and at the same time broken-hearted voice, and she began to discuss the question of the price of the plot with Sokolov, Peter Ivanovich, lighting up, heard her asking in great detail about the prices of various plots and determining which should be taken. Besides that, having finished about the plot, she also gave orders about the choir. Sokolov left. "I do everything myself," she said to Peter Ivanovich, pushing aside the albums that lay on the table, and noticing that the table was threatened with ashes, she promptly moved an ashtray for Peter Ivanovich and said, "I find it false to claim that grief prevents me from concerning myself with practical matters. On the contrary, if anything can, not comfort, but distract me, it is my troubles over him." She took out her handkerchief again as if she was about to cry, but since she's faking, but suddenly, as if overcoming herself, gave a shake and began to speak calmly. "However, I have business with you." Peter Ivanovich bowed, not allowing the springs of the poof, which at once began stirring under him, to act up. During the last days, he suffered terribly. "He suffered very much?" asked Peter Ivanovich. "Ah, terribly. The last, not minutes, but hours, he didn't stop screaming. For 3 days in a row, he screamed incessantly. It was unbearable. I can't understand how I endured it. It could be heard through 3 doors. Ah, what I've endured." "And can it be that he was conscious?" "Yes," she whispered, "till the last moment. He said farewell to us a quarter of an hour before he died, and he also asked that Volodya be taken away." The thought of a suffering man he had known so closely, as a merry boy, a schoolmate, then as an adult colleague, despite the unpleasant awareness of his own and this woman's falsity, suddenly terrified Peter Ivanovich. He again saw that forehead, and he's terrified. Why is he terrified? Because, again, it reflects back on himself. Because we're done here, I realize that. I'm not sure. Is it his son? Might be his son. He comes in later. Not 100% sure, but I believe so. 3 days of terrible suffering and then death. Now, for a Christian reader, we're going to think about the 3 days and the significance of that there. But yes?
It says his son's name is Vazia, but could Bologna be another person?
I don't think so, but it could be. Yeah, I don't want to say with certitude. I genuinely don't know who Volodya is here. But let me skip. I'll leave it off at that. A taste of it, the introduction. It's really helpful just to get. This is Tolstoy's style. It's brilliant at pulling you in and imagining the dynamic. You almost see the characters in front of you and how they interact. It's very realistic, I think, and stylistically quite brilliant. I'll leave it off with that for now and pick it up next.